The whispers followed the rifle. At forward operating base Kestrel, a place where uniformity was a survival instinct, Specialist Alara Vance's weapon was an anomaly, an affront. It looked broken. The soldiers, young men and women weaned on factory-fresh M4S and state-of-the-art optics, mocked it in hushed tones. They saw a scarred fiberglass stock from a bygone era, crudely bonded to a modern chassis. They saw a barrel whose finish was worn to a dull gray, and a scope held on by a mix of mismatched rings, one of which looked suspiciously civilian. They called it the junker, the parts bin special, the broken stick. The mockery of her rifle was constant, a low hum of disrespect. But soon, they would all be watching that broken thing, and the woman who held it, as she prepared to hit a target 2,000 yards away, not once but 10 times in a row. Alara felt the stares as she crossed the gravel expanse of the parade ground. The Afghan sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the HESCO barriers and the corrugated steel roofs of the barracks. Dust, the consistency of fine flour, coated everything, including the inside of her lungs. Her transfer had been abrupt, processed with a quiet urgency that suggested less a strategic reassignment and more a problem being moved out of sight. She was assigned to logistics, a data entry clerk tasked with tracking ammunition inventories. It was a role for a private fresh from basic, not a specialist with more than a decade of service. But Alara did not complain. She moved into the cramped barracks, her footsteps silent on the plywood floor. She unpacked her meager belongings with an economy of motion that was almost unnerving. A few sets of fatigues, a small, worn book of poetry, and the long, heavy rifle case. When she finally unlatched it, Corporal Thorne, a young soldier with more confidence than experience, sauntered over. He craned his neck, expecting to see a new State Route 25 or perhaps a heavily modified M110. Instead, he saw the junker. Its stock was a pale, scarred green, the kind you'd find on a hunting rifle from the last century, and it was attached to the metal receiver with what looked like industrial epoxy and a series of small, precisely drilled bolts. The scope was a powerful, modern piece of glass, but it sat atop the action like a crown on a beggar. Thorne snorted, a sharp, derisive sound. "What in the world is that thing, Specialist? Did you win it at a county fair?" His friends chuckled along with him. Alara didn't look at him. Her attention was on the rifle. She ran a calloused thumb along the cold steel of the bolt, her touch gentle, reverent. "It works," she said, her voice low and even, carrying no hint of defensiveness. It was a simple statement of fact. Thorne shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips. "Sure it does, Specialist. Just don't point it at anything important." He walked away, the laughter of his cohort trailing behind him. Alara finished assembling the rifle, the heavy barrel clicking into place, the bolt sliding home with the sound of oiled steel. She leaned it against her locker, a silent, ugly sentinel in a world of polished, identical weapons. It was out of place. So was she. Colonel Hayes was a man who believed the soul of a unit could be measured by the shine on its boots and the uniformity of its equipment. He moved through the barracks on his morning inspection like a storm front, his gaze missing nothing. He corrected gig lines, noted dusty rifle racks, and left a trail of nervous lieutenants in his wake. Then he saw it. Leaning against a locker at the end of the row, Alara's rifle was a jarring note in his symphony of military order. He stopped dead, his face tightening. "Specialist," he barked, not bothering to learn her name. Alara, who had been organizing data slates at her small desk, stood at attention. Hayes pointed a rigid finger at the weapon. "What is that abomination?" His voice was cold, laced with contempt. "It's my rifle, sir." "That is not a rifle," Hayes countered, stepping closer to inspect it. He ran a gloved finger over the crude seam where would met metal. "This is a collection of mismatched parts. It looks like something a backwoods insurgent would cobble together in a cave. It is a disgrace to this base and to the uniform you wear." "Where is your service-issue weapon?" "In storage, sir. Per my transfer orders, I am authorized to carry a personally calibrated weapon system." Hayes snatched the data slate from her desk, his eyes scanning the transfer authorization. He saw the paragraphs of blacked-out text, the high-level overrides from commands he didn't recognize. It reeked of special treatment, of some backroom deal that had saddled him with this odd, quiet woman and her junkyard firearm. It infuriated him. Personally calibrated, he sneered, tossing the slate back onto the desk. This thing looks like it was calibrated with a hammer and a prayer. I will not have this thing seen on my FOB. You are hereby reassigned. He didn't wait for a response. You will report to the range master. Your new duty is permanent range maintenance. You will sweep brass, patch targets, and stay out of sight. Is that clear? Crystal, sir, Alara said, her voice betraying no emotion. Hayes gave the rifle one last look of disgust. And keep that piece of scrap metal with you. I don't want it contaminating my armory. He turned on his heel and strode away, leaving Alara standing at perfect attention in the suffocating silence. The other soldiers in the bay studiously avoided her eyes, but she could feel their pity and their amusement. She was the weird woman with the broken rifle, now officially cast out to the fringes of the base, a janitor on the firing line. The firing range at FOB Kestrel was a desolate stretch of packed earth and shimmering heat. It was a valley of noise and dust, where soldiers came to practice the art of controlled violence. For Alara, it was a sanctuary. Her duties were menial as Colonel Hayes intended. She spent her days under the relentless sun, sweeping up thousands of spent brass casings, the metallic tang of gunpowder a constant presence in the air. She patched bullet holes in paper targets and reset steel plates that had been knocked down. The other soldiers, the ones who came to train, treated her as part of the landscape. She was the quiet woman who brought them fresh targets and collected their garbage. They didn't know she was watching. She observed everything. She saw the way the wind, fickle and treacherous, curled down from the high ridges, creating eddies and updrafts that could push a bullet off course by several feet at 1,000 yards. She noted how the mirage, the shimmering distortion of heat rising from the ground, flowed like a river, and she learned to read its currents. The snipers, in particular, drew her focus. She watched the base's elite marksman team, a group of 4 cocky young sergeants who thought themselves gods with their $500,000 of government-issued rifles and scopes. She saw their flaws. She saw Sergeant Davis, the team leader, flinch ever so slightly before the rifle fired, a subconscious reaction that sent his rounds wide. She saw Corporal Jensen struggle with his breathing, holding it for too long, causing his heart rate to spike and his sight picture to tremble. They were good shooters, but they were not masters of their craft. They fought the environment instead of becoming part of it. At night, while the others slept or watched movies on their tablets, Alara would sit by her rifle, cleaning it with a surgeon's care. She kept a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with meticulous, handwritten notes. They were not a diary. They were data: wind speeds, temperature fluctuations, humidity levels, barometric pressure readings. She sketched the valley, drawing arrows to indicate the prevailing wind currents at different times of day. She calculated trajectory shifts based on the angle of the sun and the density of the air. The mockery from soldiers like Corporal Thorne continued, though it was less direct now. They'd see her sitting on the berm, staring into the distance for an hour without moving, scribbling in her little book. The range which, they'd mutter. Talking to the wind, they saw a strange woman engaged in a pointless ritual. They had no idea she was preparing. She wasn't just sweeping brass. She was studying the battlefield, learning its every secret, its every breath. Her mind was a finely tuned ballistic computer, and this dusty, forgotten range was her laboratory. The broken rifle that leaned against the wall of the range shack wasn't a piece of junk. It was the key, and she was patiently waiting for the right lock. The pressure began with the arrival of a 2-star general and his entourage. They were on a tour of the region, and FOB Kestrel was a key stop. Colonel Hayes, desperate to impress, had arranged a live-fire demonstration of a new piece of technology, the Automated Dynamic Targeting System, or ADTS. It was a series of advanced armored targets mounted on a robotic track system along the far ridge. The system was designed to simulate the unpredictable movements of an enemy sniper, popping up from behind cover at extreme ranges for mere seconds. It was the future of marksman training, and Hayes had staked a good deal of his reputation on its success. The demonstration was a disaster. The wind, which had been a steady breeze all morning, turned into a blustering, gusting gale. It whipped down the valley, kicking up clouds of dust and making consistent shooting nearly impossible. The ADTS, for its part, was performing flawlessly, which only made things worse. Its programming was set to an advanced difficulty, presenting targets at 1,500 yards for a window of only 4 seconds. Sergeant Davis and his sniper team were at the firing line, their state-of-the-art rifles resting on sturdy bipods. The general stood behind them with Colonel Hayes, their arms crossed, their expressions growing stonier with every missed shot. Target up. Sector 4, 1500 yards. The range officer called. A steel silhouette appeared from behind a rocky outcrop. Davis was on it instantly, his expensive scope giving him a clear picture. He held his breath, accounted for the wind, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle boomed, but the only sound that returned from the ridge was the howl of the wind. The target vanished. "Miss!" came the call. "Wind got it," Davis muttered, frustration coloring his voice. He made another adjustment to his scope. The next target appeared. Another miss. Then another. The other members of his team fared no better. They fired round after round, their bullets kicking up dust far to the left or right of the silhouettes. They blamed the system, the ammunition, the unpredictable gusts. Their excuses grew thinner with each failure. Colonel Hayes's face was a thundercloud. He could feel the general's unimpressed gaze on the back of his neck. This was supposed to be a showcase of his base's cutting-edge capabilities. Instead, it was a humiliating display of incompetence. After 20 minutes and 40 missed shots, Sergeant Davis lowered his rifle, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Sir, the conditions are impossible," he said, turning to Hayes. "The gusts are unpredictable. Nobody can make that shot today." The general raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The silence was more damning than any reprimand. The multimillion-dollar system was being defeated by a stiff breeze. The pressure in the air was thick enough to taste, a mix of failure, frustration, and the colonel's barely contained rage. Alara, standing by the range shack with a broom in her hand, had watched the entire spectacle. She had felt the wind on her face, watched the mirage dance, and known exactly where every single one of their bullets had gone. As Sergeant Davis and his team began packing up their gear, their shoulders slumped in defeat, Colonel Hayes was preparing to offer a stilted apology to the general. The demonstration was over, a complete and utter failure. He opened his mouth to speak, but a quiet voice cut through the tense atmosphere. "Permission to try, sir." Every head on the firing line turned. Alara Vance had stepped forward from the shadows of the range shack. She held her broken rifle in one hand, its ugly, composite form a stark contrast to the sleek, modern weapons being put away. A few of the snipers snickered. Corporal Thorne, who was assisting the team, openly laughed. The idea was absurd. The best shooters on the base with the best equipment money could buy had failed completely. And now the range janitor with her junkyard gun wanted a turn. Colonel Hayes's face turned a shade darker. This was the final indignity. "Specialist, get back to your duties," he hissed, his voice low and furious. "You are embarrassing this command." But the visiting general, a man named Peters, stepped forward. He had a curious glint in his eye. He had seen enough spit and polish demonstrations to last a lifetime. This, however, was interesting. "Let her shoot, Colonel," Peters said, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "At this point, what have we got to lose?" Hayes stiffened, trapped. To refuse a direct suggestion from a two-star general was unthinkable. He gave Alara a venomous glare. "Fine," he spat. "You have one shot. Do not waste our time." Alara gave a slight nod. She walked to the empty firing position, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She didn't use a fancy bipod. She simply dropped to the ground, settling into the prone position with a practiced fluidity. From a pouch on her belt, she produced a small, worn canvas bag filled with sand, which she placed under the stock of the rifle, creating a stable rear rest. She didn't consult a digital wind meter or a ballistic calculator. She simply lay there for a moment, her eyes closed, feeling the wind on her cheek. She glanced once at the sky, then at a distant flag on the far side of the base. She opened the small notebook from her pocket, flipped to a page, and made a single-minute adjustment to the elevation turret on her scope. "Range, activate target," Hayes ordered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Target up. Sector 2, 1510 yards." The call came. A silhouette popped into view, a dark shape against the brown ridge. The 4-second window began. Alara's breathing slowed until it was almost imperceptible. She exhaled slowly, smoothly. The world seemed to narrow, her focus shrinking until it contained only the reticle and the target. At the very bottom of her breath, in the natural respiratory pause, she applied pressure to the trigger. The rifle cracked a sharp, clean report. It was a lighter sound than the heavy 338s the sniper team had been using. The recoil was absorbed seamlessly by her body. For a second, there was only the sound of the wind. Then, a faint but distinct sound echoed back across the valley. Ping! A wave of silence washed over the firing line. The snipers froze. Colonel Hayes's jaw went slack. The range officer, staring through his high-powered spotting scope, spoke into his microphone. His voice filled with disbelief. "Hit. Confirmed centermass hit." The metallic echo of the impact hung in the air long after the sound itself had faded, replaced by a silence so profound it felt louder than the gunshot. Every person on the firing line, from the general down to the lowest private, was staring at the prone figure of Alara Vance. She hadn't moved. After the shot, she had simply worked the bolt on her rifle with practiced efficiency, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a new round. Her expression was unreadable, her focus still directed downrange, as if she were waiting for the next target. The sniper team, who moments before had been laughing, now looked utterly bewildered. Sergeant Davis stared at his own multi-thousand-dollar rifle as if it had personally betrayed him. He had fired 10 rounds using the most advanced ballistic computer available and had missed every time. This woman, with a rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum of military failures, had made the shot on her first attempt in gale force winds. The whispers started then, but their tone had changed completely. The mockery was gone, replaced by a confused, hesitant curiosity. "How?" Corporal Thorne whispered to the man next to him. "The wind is gusting over 20 knots out there. My Kestrel was reading 3 different wind directions between here and the ridge. Did you see her setup?" Another soldier murmured. "No bipod, just a sandbag. And she didn't even use a wind meter." They began to look at her rifle differently. The scuffs and scratches on the old stock no longer looked like neglect. They looked like history. The strange, mismatched scope rings no longer seemed amateurish. They seemed purposeful, as if they were placed in that exact configuration for a reason she understood and they did not. The worn finish on the barrel spoke not of disuse, but of 1,000 days spent on 1,000 ranges just like this one. Colonel Hayes was wrestling with a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. His initial fury had been replaced by sheer, dumbfounded shock, which was now giving way to a grudging, unwilling flicker of interest. He was a man who respected results above all else, and the result was undeniable. A clear, ringing hit on a 1,500-yard target in impossible conditions. It defied logic. It defied his understanding of marksmanship. He looked at Alara, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw not a clumsy clerk or a range janitor, but a figure of absolute stillness and control. There was a dangerous competence about her, a quiet lethality he had completely failed to notice. General Peters, however, was smiling faintly. He walked over to the range officer and spoke quietly. The officer looked through his spotting scope again and then made a call on his radio. He was pointing toward a different part of the mountain range, much farther away. The atmosphere on the line had shifted from tense failure to electric anticipation. Alara remained on the ground, a coiled spring of potential, oblivious to the stares and the whispers. She had done what was asked. Now she waited. Colonel Hayes strode over to where Alara lay, his boots crunching on the gravel. His face was a mask of cold professionalism, but his eyes betrayed a deep-seated disbelief. He would not accept what he had just seen. A single shot could be a fluke, a one-in-a-million chance guided by a lucky gust of wind. He needed to reassert control, to restore the natural order of things where his elite, hand-picked snipers were the experts and this quiet, strange woman was an anomaly to be dismissed. "That was a fluke, specialist," Hayes said, his voice flat and hard. "A lucky shot." Alara didn't respond. She simply looked up at him, her gaze steady. Hayes pointed toward a distant ridge, far beyond the ADTS track. On the mountainside, barely visible to the naked eye, was a small, glinting object. It was an old steel service marker, a 10 by 10-inch plate used for surveying, forgotten by time and weather. "You see that marker?" he demanded. The range officer, prompted by the general, spoke into his microphone. Distance confirmed. 2,000 yards. A collective gasp went through the assembled soldiers. 2,000 yards was a mythical distance. It was over a mile. Hitting a stationary target at that range on a perfectly calm day was a feat few snipers in the entire military could accomplish. In these winds, it was considered impossible. "No one on this base can hit that target," Hayes stated, his voice ringing with challenge. "Not my best men, not on their best day." He looked down at Alara, his eyes narrowed. He was setting an impossible standard, a test designed to expose her lucky shot for what it was and humble her publicly. "You want to impress me? You want me to believe that wasn't luck?" He leaned in slightly. "Hit it. 10 times. In a row." The challenge hung in the air, audacious and cruel. 10 consecutive hits on a target that size at that range in these conditions. It wasn't a test of skill. It was a demand for a miracle. The snipers looked at each other, shaking their heads. Even if she hit it once, the odds of doing it again, let alone 10 times, were astronomical. The slightest miscalculation in windage, the tiniest variation in air temperature or humidity, would send the bullet careening off into the mountainside. The bullet would be in the air for over 3 seconds, a tiny piece of metal at the mercy of a chaotic environment. General Peters watched the exchange with keen interest, a slight smile touching his lips. He knew something Hayes didn't. He was not watching a test. He was watching a reawakening. Without a word, Alara pushed herself up slightly, adjusting her position to face the new target. She pulled her sandbag a few inches to the left, settling the rifle stock into it. She reached into her pouch and produced a single, hand-loaded cartridge, placing it on the mat beside her. The bullet was longer, heavier, and more streamlined than standard issue. She consulted her notebook again, her finger tracing a line on a complex chart. She began clicking the turrets on her scope, the precise, audible adjustments echoing in the silent tension. 128 clicks for elevation, 37 for windage. The crowd held its breath. The stage was set for either a spectacular confirmation of skill or a humiliating failure. As Alara dialed in her scope, the general's aide, a young captain, approached Colonel Hayes and discreetly handed him a military-grade tablet. "Sir," the captain said in a low voice, "General Peters asked me to run the specialist service number through a priority channel. Her file was just declassified for command-level eyes." Hayes took the tablet, his brow furrowed in annoyance. He was focused on the drama unfolding on the firing line, but an order from the general was an order. He glanced down at the screen. The first thing he saw was her full name, Alara Vance. Below it was a call sign, a single word that sent a jolt through him, a name he had only ever heard spoken in hushed, reverent tones in intelligence briefings. "Ghost." He scrolled down, his eyes widening, his breath catching in his throat. The redacted file was now open to him. Operation Spectre, the Ghost program. It was a unit that technically didn't exist, a Black Ops team of solo operatives tasked with impossible missions deep in enemy territory. They were legends, myths whispered about in the special operations community. And Alara Vance wasn't just a member. She was its alpha asset, the most successful operative in the program's shadowy history, with a list of confirmed kills so long and so sensitive it was classified well above his own pay grade. The tablet detailed missions that read like fiction, eliminating high-value targets from mountain peaks across impassable borders, providing overwatch for Delta Force teams from distances considered mathematically impossible. The rifle, the junker he had mocked so viciously, was also detailed in the file. It was designated the Scythe. It wasn't a collection of parts. It was a bespoke weapon system she had built and refined over 15 years. The old stock was custom-weighted to perfectly balance the heavy, cryogenically treated barrel. The mismatched scope rings were an intentional design, engineered to counteract barrel torque at extreme ranges. Every scratch, every modification had a purpose. It was an extension of her body, tuned to her unique physiology and skill set. The file ended with a brief, heavily censored summary of her final mission. An ambush, a catastrophic injury, a long recovery, and then a request for a quiet, non-combatant posting under a restricted identity. She hadn't been sent to FOB Kestrel as a problem to be hidden. She had been sent here to heal, to be left alone in anonymity. Colonel Hayes looked up from the tablet, his face pale. He looked at the woman on the ground, no longer seeing a misfit clerk but a living legend. He had taken a master artist, the greatest practitioner of her craft, and handed her a broom. His arrogance, his blind adherence to superficial uniformity, felt like a physical weight in his stomach. He was not watching a fluke. He was watching the methodical, deadly application of a skill he could not even begin to comprehend. And he had just challenged her to prove it to him. On the firing mat, Alara was deaf to the world. The whispers, the tension, the shocked realization dawning on her commanding officer. None of it penetrated the bubble of pure focus she had created. Her world had shrunk to the rifle, the wind, and a tiny square of steel over a mile away. Her heartbeat was slow and steady, a metronome counting down to the moment of release. She chambered the first round. The bolt slid home with a sound like a key turning in a well-oiled lock. She settled her eye behind the scope, the powerful optic bringing the distant target into view. It was small, shimmering in the heat haze. To her, the mirage wasn't a distraction. It was information. She watched it flow from left to right, a steady 8-mile-per-hour river of air. But she also saw the subtle vertical shifts in the sagebrush on the ridge, telling her of a slight updraft near the target. She held 0.2 of a mil high and a full mil left. She took a final breath, let half of it out, and the rifle fired. The wait was agonizing for the onlookers. The bullet was on its own journey, a 3.5-second flight across the valley. Alara already knew. She had felt it in the rifle, seen it in her mind's eye. The sound, when it came, was impossibly small, a tiny tink carried back on the wind. The spotter, one of Hayes's snipers now tasked with watching her shots, yelled into his radio, his voice cracking with excitement. Hit! Dead center! Confirmed hit! A murmur went through the crowd. One was a fluke. Two would be a pattern. Alara worked the bolt, her movements smooth, economical. She chambered the second round. She made a micro-adjustment to her windage, a single click. The wind had shifted, almost imperceptibly, but she had felt it. She fired. 3.5 seconds later, tink. Hit! The spotter screamed. The third shot followed. Tink. Hit! Fourth, fifth, sixth. It was no longer a shooting demonstration. It was a symphony of precision. Each movement was identical. The smooth bolt action, the slight shift of her shoulder to resettle into the rifle, the slow, controlled breath. She was a machine. She was not aiming. She was connecting 2 points in space with a line of absolute certainty. The arrogance had long since vanished from the faces of the base snipers. They now watched with the rapt attention of students at the feet of a master. They were witnessing a level of skill they had not known was possible. Colonel Hayes stood frozen, the tablet clutched in his hand. He was replaying every dismissive word, every condescending glance. He had called her weapon an abomination. He had called her an embarrassment. He now understood that he was in the presence of greatness, and he had treated it with contempt. 7th shot. Tink. 8th. Tink. 9th. The crowd was completely silent, every soldier holding their breath with her. She chambered the final round. The 10th cartridge. The wind picked up for a moment, a sudden violent gust kicking up a swirl of dust around her. She waited. She did not fight it. She waited for it to pass, for the air to settle back into its rhythm. The moment came. She exhaled. The rifle cracked one last time. The final agonizing wait. Tink. Perfect, clear, ringing impact. 10 for 10. Alara Vance cleared the rifle, making it safe. She pushed herself up from the ground, her movements as calm and deliberate as they had been before the first shot. She stood and turned to face the stunned audience. The impossible had been made real. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Colonel Hayes began to walk toward her. He moved not with the arrogant stride of a commander, but with the measured, humbled steps of a man who has witnessed something that has fundamentally changed his understanding of the world. He stopped directly in front of her. He looked at her, at the woman he had sent to sweep floors, and then at the rifle he had called junk. He didn't speak. Words were inadequate. Instead, he brought his hand up in a slow, sharp, perfect salute. It was not the perfunctory gesture of a superior to a subordinate. It was a sign of profound, absolute respect. Seeing their commander's action, Sergeant Davis and his entire sniper team snapped to attention and saluted as one. Then Corporal Thorne, then the range officer, then every single soldier on the line. A wave of salutes rippled through the crowd, a silent, unanimous acknowledgement of the mastery they had just witnessed. Alara, her face still impassive, returned the colonel's salute with a crisp, formal gesture of her own. The debt of disrespect had been paid in full. That evening, the story of the 10 shots spread through FOB Kestrel like a brushfire. The range which, with the broken rifle, was now spoken of in hushed, awestruck tones. The mockery had vanished, replaced by a mythology that grew with every telling. They called her Ghost, a name that had somehow leaked out, adding to her mystique. But Alara was not in the mess hall, listening to the praise. She was not in the recreation tent, accepting congratulations. She was in the armory, alone, in a quiet corner she had claimed as her own. The scythe was disassembled on a soft, oil-stained cloth. Each component, once mocked, was now laid bare, revealing its true nature. The scarred stock was made of a lightweight, high-density polymer, its surface intentionally roughened for a better grip in any condition. The epoxy and bolts that held it to the chassis were not crude repairs, but a custom bedding job, ensuring a perfect, vibration-free fit between the action and the stock, a critical element for accuracy. The barrel, worn on the outside, was pristine on the inside, its rifling sharp and clean. She cleaned each piece with a meticulous, practiced touch. The bolt, the trigger assembly, the firing pin. This was her ritual, a quiet communion with the tool of her trade. It was not a weapon to her. It was a part of her. It held the memories of cold mountain nights, of long, patient waits, of moments when the fate of a mission rested on a single, steady heartbeat. The cleaning was not a chore. It was an act of respect for the instrument that had saved her life more times than she could count. The door to the armory creaked open. Corporal Thorne stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the evening light. He held a tray with a steaming plate of food from the mess hall and a full canteen of fresh water. He hesitated for a moment, as if unsure of what to say. The words of his earlier mockery probably echoed in his mind. He walked over, not to her, but to a nearby workbench and carefully set the tray down. He looked at Alara, at the disassembled rifle, and then back at her. He said nothing. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of apology, of respect, of awe. Then he turned and left as quietly as he had come. Alara watched him go. She picked up a soft cloth and gave the scope's lens a final, gentle polish. She looked down at the pieces of her rifle, laid out like the bones of a fallen god. The weapon, once a symbol of her outcast status, was now the source of her legend. But to her it was neither. It was simply hers. She had earned her place not with words or rank, but with quiet competence and undeniable proof. In the silence of the armory, surrounded by the smell of gun oil and steel, Alara Vance, the ghost of Kestrel, began to put her rifle back together. Respect, once lost, had been found again, forged in the crucible of a long-range shot and sealed with the quiet dignity of a job well done.